This is BBC News. I'm Chris Rogers. The headlines at 6. Good evening and welcome to BBC News. So talks are taking place in Vienna between the United States and Iran ahead of a widely anticipated announcement that international sanctions against Iran will be lifted. The international nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, is expected to rule that Iran has scaled back its atomic program, confirmation of which will prompt the lifting of sanctions. Well, this afternoon, Iran said it had released 4 prisoners with dual US-Iranian nationality as part of a prisoner exchange with the United States. Our diplomatic correspondent Bridget Kendall reports now from Vienna.
Released today from captivity for allegedly plotting against the Iranian state, Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, along with 3 other Iranian-American captives, Amir Hekmati on the left and Saeed Abedini on the right, and a 4th man, Nosratollah Khosravi, all freed in a dramatic prisoner swap with the United States. On the very day, the Iranian foreign minister came to Vienna for the other expected momentous news, that Iran has cut back its nuclear program enough to get years of crippling international sanctions lifted.
Today is a day when we prove to the world that threats, sanctions, intimidation, pressure don't work. Respect works. Through respect, through dialogue, through negotiations, we can in fact reach mutually acceptable solutions.
In Tehran, they were following the latest news closely. The sanctions on Iran have been the most extensive and complex in the world, banning not just trade, but even moving money around. Now, in one big sweep, the world is lifting most of the restrictions.
Of course, people's economic situation will become much better. Now there's a lot of pressure on people. Too much. Everyone has 2 jobs.
If sanctions are lifted, we can have low prices, inflation will go down, and this will help the quality of life for people in Iran.
Some sanctions will remain, but overall this is a significant milestone, a promise of the end of years of isolation for Iran. Its oil can now start to flow out again, and investors can dive in once they've got the confidence that the sanctions winter is well and truly over. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, Vienna.
Well, joining me now from outside the talks in Vienna is our correspondent Bethany Bell, and from Washington we're joined by Barbara Plett-Usher. First of all, to you, Bethany, we were expecting an announcement of some kind some hours ago. Do we have any idea what the delay is? Is it perhaps the prisoner exchange, or are there some other sticking points?
It's not entirely clear. Some US officials on background have been saying that the prisoner swap was not responsible for the delay. On the other hand, we're not quite clear. There was a little bit of a flurry just a few minutes ago, security moving around here, which could suggest that the Iranian foreign minister, the EU's foreign policy chief, and the US Secretary of State may be heading here to the UN headquarters of the IAEA in Vienna for some sort of statement. We're still waiting to see, but we understand that in terms of the choreography of today, the IAEA needs to release a statement which we understand will say that Iran has scaled back its nuclear activities enough to allow the sanctions relief to take place.
And there's a lot of optimism, isn't there, particularly from Iran. We can't underestimate what this means, particularly for the Iranian people.
People are waiting very, very closely to hear when this moment that the IAEA will announce that Iran has done enough to fill its side of the bargain that will allow the green light for the lifting of sanctions. This is something people have waited for a very, very long time. It will see them coming out of the cold in terms of re-entering the global economy. So yes, there are a lot of Iranian journalists here waiting to report that news.
And Barbara, in Washington, the advantages of this deal that's been struck between America and Iran are obvious to many, but not everybody where you are is pleased about this.
There is strong political opposition to the deal and has been all along from the Republicans, the Republican-dominated Congress, and also the Republican presidential candidates who have criticized President Obama for it. They have said that it's not tough enough, it doesn't limit Iran's nuclear program enough, it doesn't carry those limitations long enough, and that Iran will benefit from a sanctions windfall, which will then help it to become even more of a problem in their view. They still see Iran as an enemy. There's still a lot of suspicion about Iran. There's a long history of hostility that has not been overcome. And that whole issue of prisoners, the Iranian Americans held in prison in Iran, hasn't helped either. And Mr. Obama had come under criticism from Republicans, and particularly for not tying that to the nuclear accord, for not saying we won't agree with the nuclear accord unless you release those prisoners. So the fact that they are being released today is, I guess, President Obama's answer to that.
Yeah, and there's been a flurry of activity, hasn't there, in the last hour, and taking some journalists by surprise. But can you just bring us up to date on where we are now, and if we know exactly who it is that has been released?
Yes, U.S. officials have given a bit more detail about what happened, that 4 Iranian Americans have been released. This includes, of course, Jason Rezaian, who is the Washington Post correspondent who was charged in espionage. It includes Saeed Abedini, who is a Christian pastor. He was detained in 2012, presumably for some issues around Christian proselytizing, and it includes a former U.S. Marine who was arrested when he went back to visit his family, also charged on espionage charges. There is a separate release. A young student has been released also by the Iranians. It's not part of this prisoner exchange, so to speak. And then on the American side, the Americans have agreed to offer clemency to 7 Iranians who have either been convicted or are pending trial for violations of sanctions, and they have agreed to drop charges against 14 individuals who they said it became clear would probably never be given to them through extradition purposes. So they have also taken steps, and we understand that the 4 Iranian Americans have been taken to Switzerland, flown there by a Swiss plane, and that they are en route to a U.S. military base in Germany where they will receive medical examinations.
Barbara Pladusher in Washington, Bethany Bell in Vienna, many thanks. Well, as you heard Bethany say there, a lifting of sanctions, not all of them, were making a huge difference to the people of Iran and, of course, people who want to do business with the country. Our business correspondent Joe Lynham has this assessment now of the end of the sanctions.
Iran has been frozen out of the international economy for decades, especially from the American economy since 1979. Formerly oil sanctions and all sanctions, you couldn't really deal with Iran at all since 2012 for European companies. So it's a very significant moment. The Iranians really want to sell their oil so they can make money. This is an economy that is not growing at all and hasn't really grown in the last 10 years or so, even though the potential is huge. Over 30% of the Iranian population is under 30. They are a young, educated Middle Eastern country that has ambitions to be a major force within the Middle East. Add in the fact they have creaking infrastructure which needs to be improved, which will need advice. They have airlines which are potentially 20 and 30 years old, which need to be repaired. We've seen announcements potentially from Airbus that you made reference to. And of course there's oil. But of course the downside of oil is they are selling into a plunging oil market. So it couldn't have come at the worst time for them to start selling oil, but there is so much other things that can happen in Iran.
So are you saying that Iran does have money to spend and it does have a workforce to put to work?
Potentially has a huge workforce, a very well-educated workforce that could turn Iran into a genuine powerhouse in the Middle East. As for money to spend, it depends on what figures you believe. Some people have quoted the figure of $30 billion in frozen Iranian assets, especially in Switzerland and the States and in Europe, which will be unfrozen. That money could then come feasibly back to Iran to be invested. Of course, it may not work out that way. Some people even said $100 billion. It depends what figures you believe. No one knows for sure. But there's definitely money there that will be unfrozen that can be used for investment purposes, and Iran needs it.
Well, you can get more on this story, including analysis and background from our correspondents in the region. That's all at bbc.co.uk/news.